Chapter 37. Will, Umar, and 120 Bedouin warriors were on a forced march across the desert. They rose 4 hours before dawn, rode until 4 hours after first light, then rested through the heat of the day. In the late afternoon, a few hours before sunset, they would set out again, riding until well after dark before they stopped to rest again. Will estimated that it was around 9 in the evening when they would camp for the night. But the 2 rest periods, one in the middle of the day and the other late at night, gave them plenty of time to water and feed their horses and recover their strength for the next march. It was a hard schedule, but a sensible one. They rode at a steady pace, trotting their horses rather than cantering or galloping. But Will soon realized that they were covering great distances by keeping to the steady pace, even though he was tempted to go faster. As the kilometers reeled by under Tug's hooves, he knew that this would be the better course in the long run. Umar had decided to act on Jamil's assertion that the Tuolagi were headed for one of the towns in the northern massif. As a result, they were able to plan a straight-line course to intercept the raiders, rather than return to the site of the battle and follow their tracks. This, combined with the prodigious distances they were able to cover each day, meant they were well on the way to overhauling the enemy. Will had asked Umar and Jamil to show him the location of the massif on his chart. It was further to the north than the area covered by Selathan's chart. They studied that document with some interest, rapidly seeing its relevance, even though the Bedouin never used charts themselves. Their navigation was based on tribal law and knowledge handed down over hundreds of years. As they pointed to landmarks drawn by Selathan, they would refer to places by names such as River of Bright Stones, or Ali's Hill, or the Snake Wadi. While some of the names were self-explanatory, the origin of others was hidden in antiquity. Nobody, for example, had the slightest memory of who Ali might have been, and the bright stones that marked the river had long since disappeared, as had the river itself. This was a war party, so the Koresh Bedouin women and children had remained at the oasis camp, with 70 of Umar's warriors to keep them safe. The Asik was reluctant to reduce his attack force by so many, but the desert was an uncertain place, and 70 was the minimum number of men he was willing to leave for the protection of his people. "We'll be outnumbered," he remarked to Will. "They won't be expecting us," the young ranger replied, and the Asik nodded with a certain grim satisfaction. "I'm looking forward to that." On the 3rd day of travel, the problem of numbers was redressed. A forward scout rode back at a gallop to report that he had encountered a party of 30 men on foot in the desert. Umar, Will, and Hassan rode back with him, cantering ahead of the main party. After 3 kilometers, they came upon the group of men, sitting in the meager shade afforded by a wadi bank and sharing the last of a water skin the scout had left with them. "Aridi troopers," Umar said, recognizing the remnants of the uniforms they wore. Will noticed that none of the men wore boots, although they had torn cloth from their cloaks and shirts to wrap around their feet for protection. There was barely more than a mouthful each in the water skin, and the distribution was being carefully overseen by a young man who still wore a lieutenant's insignia. The group might be ragged and close to exhaustion, but it was obvious they had maintained their discipline. Will wasn't certain, but the officer looked vaguely familiar. He thought he might have been one of Selathan's men. The 3 riders had carried extra water skins back with them, and these were quickly distributed. The lieutenant moved towards Umar and made the traditional greeting gesture. "Thank you, Asik," he began. He recognized Umar's badge of rank, the triple strand of horsehair rope that bound his keffiyeh. "I'm Lieutenant Alum of the—" Umar stopped him with a gesture and passed him his own water skin. The young man's voice was dry and croaking. "Drink first, Lieutenant," he told him. "The talking will be easier after that." Gratefully, the officer raised the water skin to his mouth and drank. Will noticed that even though he must have been parched, he sipped only small amounts of the water, drinking slowly so as not to overwhelm his body with a sudden flood of moisture. The people of Arida maintained excellent water discipline, he realized, remembering how desperately he had tried to gulp the water he was given when Umar found him. It was close to the 10th hour of the morning, which was the time Umar would usually call a halt for the first rest period. He signaled to the others to dismount and swung down from his saddle. "We'll camp here," he said. "The Aridi can use the rest period to recover." Lieutenant Alum had quenched his thirst now and told them of the Tuolagi ambush and the ensuing battle. How Holt and the others had been taken prisoner while he and his men had been turned out into the desert by Usal, without boots and with a bare minimum of water. That had been 2 days ago. "You've kept 30 men alive and marching with just 2 water skins?" Umar queried. There was a note of respect in his voice. The lieutenant shrugged. "They're good troops," he said. "They understood the need for discipline." "They have a good officer," Will said. He'd been tempted to interrupt the lieutenant immediately and ask for news of his friends. But he saw that the man was close to exhaustion and thought it better to let him tell his tale in his own time. The lieutenant stared at him for a moment before recognizing him. When the war party had set out from the oasis, Will had adopted Bedouin clothes, baggy trousers, a long flowing shirt and cloak, and of course, a keffiyeh to cover his head and face. But the longbow and quiver slung over his back were unmistakable. "You're the one they call Will," Alum said. "We thought you would be dead by now." Will smiled. "Glad you had such faith in me," he said. Then the smile faded. "Are Holt and the others all right? Is Evelyn safe?" Alum nodded. "They were safe when we left. Usal talked about Ransom, I think. The girl will be looked after. Chances are he'll want to sell her as a slave, and nobody wants to buy a disfigured girl slave. The men won't be so lucky. They'll be beaten, I would expect." "I agree," Umar said. He turned to Will. "They'll be uncomfortable, but it won't be too bad. There's a harsh practicality to it all. Usal won't allow them to be badly hurt. It would slow them down. The lieutenant is right about the girl, too. If there's one thing the Tuolagi are good at, it's looking after their investments." "Asik, may I ask, what are your plans?" the lieutenant asked. He glanced into the distance, where he could see the main party of Bedouin approaching. His keen eyes took in the fact that the group consisted of fighting men only, no women or children. "We're going after the Tuolagi," Will told him. "Asik Umar and his people have agreed to help me rescue my friends." "And Wakir Saleh El-Fen?" the lieutenant asked. Umar nodded confirmation. "The Wakir is an old comrade. I don't plan to leave him in Usal's grubby hands." They had been sitting in the narrow patch of shade thrown by the Wadi's bank. Alum scrambled to his feet now, with a new light of energy in his eyes. "Then let us come with you," he said. "My men and I have a score to settle with those cursed Tuolagi, and I promised my lord that we would return." Umar frowned. "Your men are exhausted and half dead from thirst," he said doubtfully. But Alum was shaking his head before he finished. "They're fit and in good condition. Let them rest overnight with food and plenty of water. They'll be ready to travel by tomorrow morning, I swear it." "You're unarmed," Will pointed out. Alum shrugged. "Surely your men can spare a few daggers. Most Bedouin carry more than one. And once the battle starts, every Tuolagi you kill will provide weapons for one of my soldiers." Will and Umar exchanged a glance. It would be handy to have an extra 30 trained fighting men, Will pointed out. Then he frowned. But how will they keep up with us? They're barefoot and walking. Umar dismissed the problem with a brief shake of his head. They can ride double with my men, he said. There's only 30 of them. We can rotate them among the force so no horse has to carry double for too long. Alum had followed the discussion between them eagerly, his eyes swinging from one to the other as they spoke. Now he raised a hand and spoke tentatively. One thing, he said. 4 of my men are wounded. We've been carrying them. They're not fit for travel or a battle. Umar weighed the problem briefly. He liked the idea of having more fighting men under his command, and he knew the Aridi troopers would give a good account of themselves. To him, the answer was obvious. We'll leave 2 of my men to look after them, he said, thinking aloud. We can leave some water with them, but they'll need most of what we have. There's a small soak half a day's ride to the east. It will provide enough water for 6 men. One of my men will fetch water while the other stays here with them. If we're successful, we'll pick them up on the return trip. He considered his own statement for a second or two, then nodded. They'd lose the evening travel period, 5 hours, and he'd weaken his force by 2 men. But in return, he'd gain 26 trained soldiers. Better yet, there were soldiers who had a score to settle with the Tuolagi. It was a good trade-off, he thought. We'll camp here through the rest of today and tonight, he said. Your men will have food and the water they need. Tell them to be ready to travel 4 hours before dawn. Alum smiled grimly. They'll be ready, he said,